My name is Brenya. I use they, them pronouns, and this is Come Together Counseling YouTube channel. In these videos, I'll be discussing healing, relationships, and the mental health field, all through an anarchist lens. So while you might connect with my approach, please remember we don't have a personal or therapeutic relationship. I'm just a person making videos. I hope you find them helpful. Today's video will be about this book, When the Body Says No, The Cost of Hidden Stress by Dr. Gabor Maté. So we'll start with a summary and get into some takeaways, some areas of growth, and then ideological disagreements before finishing up. So as you could tell from the title of this book, this is telling the story of different health conditions, a lot of autoimmune conditions, as well as things like cancer, and how that connects to the body's response to escalating stress. So when we as people are unable to say no to a person, to a situation, to an environment, often it is our body that is shutting down. So he is getting into the literature, he's talking directly with people about their experiences, drawing conclusions about people's emotional history as they develop certain conditions. So really making the connection from early childhood experiences. How do we understand ourselves? How do we understand our role in the world? What is the stress of our world as we are developing that crucial stage of early life that really sets the tone for our future? How that connects to emotional repression, how we repress our emotions rather than seek support in the future, how that is connected to future experiences of stress, which can lead to disability. So he talks specifically about the HPA axis, which stands for hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as the PNI system, which stands for psychoneuroimmunoendocrine system. And I am going to be honest in that I'm not an expert on how these systems operate. My understanding is essentially by making these connections between these different systems, putting them all together, it's an understanding of how hormones are connected to stress, are connected to how that impacts our body over time, our immune system turning inwards and attacking us rather than outside threats, viewing us as a threat, our own immune system, our organs breaking down, how basically looking at all of our systems as being interconnected, and that when mentally and emotionally we are under stress, so is the entirety of our body and the complex systems that make it up. So he talks about that. At the very end of the book, he gets into his 7 steps for healing. So when I talk about the takeaways, I will share with you what those 7 steps are and what I think about them. All right, so what are the takeaways of this book? Well, what I'm taking away is really that the stress of our early childhood environment has a monumental impact on how we cope with stress in the future, how we navigate stressful situations. Do we turn towards safe people, or have we learned through our early experiences with our caretakers that we have to handle that ourselves and that we have to push those feelings down? If that is what happens, that can lead to stress and chronic illness or disease or disability later in life. Now, modern medicine, at least in the westernized sort of sense of medicine, will divide our bodies into these mechanistic systems and to say, we're going to isolate this piece here or that piece there, and we're just going to fix the problem. We're going to fix this one thing that we see, and this over here is the problem. Modern medicine in this way doesn't see how interconnected all the systems of the body are. We have specialists who will focus on specific types of medicine and don't always communicate with each other. So there's a lack of vision of seeing the whole thing. Dr. Gabor Maté himself is a general practitioner, a family medicine doctor. And I don't know if this is something he specifically talks about in the book, but that this type of medicine is sort of looked down upon in comparison to other types of medicine because you're a generalist. You don't have quite as much expertise or relevance in specific ways. This is part of how the system prioritizes this other understanding, is by deprioritizing the generalist. Gabor also has a very expansive view of what constitutes trauma. I think this is a key to understanding the book. I have a couple of videos on trauma, which I will link on the side as well as below. Trauma is less about being able to identify from the outside, from a set list of criteria, like this happened and it's a trauma. It's more about what is the felt experience of being in a situation and what happens next. So, Gabor often talks about his own experience of being Jewish during the Holocaust when he was an infant, a baby, and talking about how this wasn't the fault of his mom or a slight on her, but that she was completely overwhelmed with stress. And so he carried that with him throughout his life, was this sense of caretaking for his mom and looking out for her and suppressing his own needs, his own emotions. And how that is connected to, I think, a lot of our experiences. If we have these type of experiences, which, full disclosure, I do have my own experience of this type of thing. Maybe I will talk more about that at some point in the future. Let me know if you would like to hear that. He has a very expansive view of what constitutes trauma, and I think it's needed. I think when we take a narrow view of trauma, we miss so much else that really we need to be looking at what are the impacts that we have had on the life of someone who's experienced trauma. How do they understand what's happened, and letting them sort of decide how do they define what's happened. Because a huge component of whether a particular experience constitutes a trauma and what is the outcome of that is how we understand it. And if we're blaming ourselves, if we think we deserved it, if we feel completely powerless, we're more likely to experience some of these effects of chronic stress and chronic pain and other forms of disability, compared to if we say, oh, this really wasn't okay, and I can see sort of what happened and I feel supported in seeking support. It's a very different experience because it doesn't sit with us. The trauma can be stored in our body in that sense of stress and tension that breaks it down over time. When we think about stress, I think a great metaphor is water and how water can wear down these very firm surfaces over time. In the United States, we have the Grand Canyon, which famously has been made by rushing water over many, many years, that now there is this huge canyon. Stress does the same thing to our bodies. If we let it sit there for so long, then it will break us down. Alternatively, if we can release the stress with a safe person, or if we feel like we can sort of resolve the initial conflict in some way, it doesn't stick around causing all of these things. Now, one thing I want to make very, very clear is that I am not blaming anybody who, for whatever reason, has repressed emotions to lead into a disability or anything like that, it's really not your fault. It is the fault of large systems in your environment and not having the support you needed to resolve whatever was coming up for you initially, not being supported in your feelings. Because I think sometimes this narrative is advanced that, we are repressing our emotions and that's resulting in us having these outcomes, and we really should stop doing that. That's really our fault. That is not what I'm saying. It is not our fault if these things happen to us. I'm going to be very clear about that. That said, if we can move through a grieving process, some of the steps which I'm about to talk about, and express those emotions that we've been pushing down for so long, sometimes these things, physical manifestations of stress and trauma in our body, can themselves also start to resolve. Now, it's not a linear process, it is not a given, and there is no returning to this before state. There isn't a before, right? Like, in many cases, there isn't a before this happened, right? Like, our development as people has been intertwined with our chronic stress. Our development growing up, there is no before, this is part of it. And so as we express emotions in a new way, we can find a new normal that is better for our bodies and for our emotional lives and for our relationships. So that said, let's get into his steps. So first step, he outlines, and he calls these the 7 A's, alliteration. They're all starting with A. First step is acceptance. So just being open to the idea that something has happened, that we have these experiences. So he starts with this idea of acceptance. He then moves into awareness, being aware of how we're feeling. We accept something happened, and now we're aware of how it has impacted us. That's his second step. Number 3, his next step is anger. And as we start to become aware of what has happened to us, we start to really feel the anger of injustice in response to our emotions being repressed by the needs of our environment, of having to give up our needs in favor of someone else, or to survive a system or environment that was not set up for us to survive. Anger is a natural first response before also feeling all of the other emotions that we can feel. I think anger really needs to come out for all of those other things to open up. What comes after that? He doesn't talk about it. Sadness, grief, loneliness, and then also moving into some of the other things he talks about. Next one, autonomy. So really building a sense of our own power, which has been restricted in a sense by suppressing our emotions. We don't know often who we are. We don't know much about our own experience. We don't feel comfortable making decisions about our own lives. And so really talking about that anger, using that anger to move towards a sense of autonomy. And with that autonomy, the next step, number 5, is attachment. Building relationships with all of our emotions, with our sense of autonomy. Building relationships with other people where we can be autonomous, we can be our full selves, and not just individual relationships, but community relationships, relationships with our natural environments, relationships with our neighborhood, all these different attachments that we have that ground us, and that we then can seek support through those attachments so that we're building a new relationship with our emotions that is connected to the world around us. So step number 6 is assertion, which he frames as being This idea that we exist, we are who we are, really asserting our sense of self as being something that exists. Now, for me, I think that's pretty much the same as autonomy. That's okay. The last step is affirmation. This is, I think, a good step to finish up with. Affirming our sense of self, actualizing that in the world. He talks about writing. He talks about sharing what he has experienced and what he knows with the world. The power of telling your story. That's what I think of when I think of affirmation. Now, a few thoughts on these steps before moving on to our areas of growth. I think first, what I'll say is that in practice, these things are not linear. We might move around in different points and be at different stages with different situations and different things. I think also the commitment to alliteration sort of left out some other emotions that are important, like sadness and frustration, feelings of alienation, which actually does start with A, so that could have been in there somewhere. Also, I think I'll leave it at there, and I'll come back to it with areas for growth. So, areas of growth for this book. There isn't so much a connection to the mental health field in saying why isn't the mental health field addressing these things, which to me is like a natural next step. Is if we're saying chronic stress is connected to chronic pain and autoimmune conditions, all these other things, where is the mental health field in this? Why are they not doing something? And why is the medical system set up this way? Looking into the history of the medical field, looking into how does money flow through that system, and who is the system built to serve? That would have been really great to spend some time talking about, but that is outside of the scope of this book. So I think that's okay. I think it's okay he didn't talk about these things as it's outside the scope of the book, but it would be really helpful to have conversation about those things. The other thing I'll say about this is I decided to read this book first before some of his later works. So he does address some of these things later. He addresses addiction in the mental health field with his book In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he addresses wider systems in his most recent book, The Myth of Normal. So I want to say this is one of his earlier books, if not his very first book. And there are a few things which I would say are missing, which he grows into those things over time. That said, there are still things which his perspective doesn't have. So I think it's part of a wider swath of other things to be engaging with in order to see the full system, what's going on. So I will share some resources in terms of the wider medical system and how that has been structured in the description. The next area of growth is that this is not a self-help book. And again, this is outside of the scope, so it is fine. But what I will say is that, the very last chapter on those 7 steps of healing is very short. I would have loved to have seen more exploration of what those things are, to have had some discussion of this is how people can engage with all of these things, because that sort of isn't there. Again, maybe that's not the scope of this book, and that's okay. However, it would have been very much enriched if we were to see how we can heal and what he thinks of, maybe having a chapter for each of those 7. Would that have made the book much longer? Maybe. But I think it would have really counterbalanced these stories of how much people are struggling with what we can do about it. The last area of growth is, it's not really explicitly politicized, which I think is connected to not seeing why the system is set up to be this way, that there's a lack of discussion of the isms. Like, where does chronic stress come from in a systemic level? From my perspective, it comes from systems of oppression and capitalism, things that directly are harming us, in particular ableism in this case. So could have used a more explicitly political message. But again, I think this is something that he steps into more later. I've seen interviews where he talks about US style capitalism and how that is harmful. It's creating a system in which it's very challenging to heal and in which there are perverse incentives for creating chronic stress in people. Yet I haven't seen him really say that there is a direct alternative, which is radical or revolutionary. And again, what I'll say is maybe that's okay. Maybe that's out of his scope, and maybe that's the role of someone like me who might be engaging with his work and saying, let's go further. So these are my areas of growth. Next is ideological disagreements. And the one point here that I really want to address is this question of like, is Gabor's thesis, which is that chronic stress can cause chronic health conditions, is that ableist? Or is the way he approaches this subject ableist? And I really don't think so. That's my perspective. Other people might have different perspectives. I really think he is not placing the blame on people when he's saying that this is something that happens. I think instead it is the medical systems that are ableist in saying that people are to blame for their own conditions. We are not to blame for our conditions. It is the medical system which is harming us and creating a lack of supports, so that placing the blame on individuals for whatever predicament we're in, and this is connected to capitalism and individualism and white supremacy and colonialism, all these things, it's connected to in the sense that individuals are blamed. And so I don't think Gabor's doing that. I don't think he's blaming individual people for having chronic stress and for having this expression of what that looks like in their body. I don't think he's placing blame on people, so this doesn't feel ableist to me. I think it is the medical system. And so in conclusion, this feels to me like a compassionate look at the connection between mind and body, and it is limited in scope. It is a little limited in scope, but I think it's something he's built on over the years. And so I really appreciate Gabor's body of work. I think what this really drives home for me is this idea of healing our minds and healing our body are not things we can do separately in isolation from each other, but that they need to come together in concert with healing our society, healing our natural environment, making drastic changes so that we are able to do that. So that's been When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Maté. If you have experiences of chronic stress or physical disability, how do you make sense of this book? You know, do you see that as being connected to each other? Or does this miss the mark for you? Let me know. Thanks for watching this video. This screen's a placeholder until I start to accrue more Patreon subscribers, at which point this is where I'll say thank you. Having patrons helps me to continue to make these videos, so if you feel you're getting something from them, consider becoming a patron. And Patreon is linked in the description as well as on my YouTube profile via all my links link. Additionally, if you like this video or share your thoughts in the comments or share this video with other people who might like it, all of these things help to ensure that this video can continue to reach people who might find it helpful. If you live or work in Pennsylvania and would be interested in scheduling a consultation to talk about becoming my therapy client, you can click to my YouTube page and then again click all my links link, and one of those links will be my therapy website, and that's where you can contact me. Say you're coming from YouTube. And if you'd like to contact me about this channel, please use the email that is listed under my About page. Thanks for your continued support. I do deeply appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video.